If you've ever fought enemies without Corrupting Blood immunity, it might have felt a little bit unfair. Corrupting Blood does an absolutely absurd amount of damage. Now, there are several immunity sources. The most commonly used are either a Mastery on the Tree, or alternatively, a Jewel Corruption. But what if you want to get some revenge, and inflict Corrupting Blood on the enemies? That's where a skill called Corrupting Fever comes in, but it's not the most straightforward thing to use. And so, in today's video, I'm going to break down how Corrupting Fever works, how you should scale it, and some of the things to keep in mind while using the skill. The first of which is, Corrupting Blood is not a bleed. Therefore, if you are scaling bleed damage over time multiplier for bleeding, ailment damage, or bleeding deals damage faster, this will not affect any of the damage done by your Corrupting Fever. The things that will affect it are physical damage over time multiplier, physical damage, damage over time, and damage over time multiplier. This might seem a little bit confusing at first, since there's the spell tag on the Corrupting Fever skill. However, keep in mind that spell damage does not innately apply to damage over time effects. Damage over time skills which are scaled by spell damage, such as Essence Drain, Wintertide Brand, or Fire Trap, all have a line of text that say modifiers to spell damage applies to this skill's damage over time. Corrupting Fever does not have that, which means you can't use spell damage to scale Corrupting Blood damage. However, Corrupting Fever is a spell, and spells tend to have pretty good returns from raising the gem level. You could even use something like a Cold Iron Point to give it +3 since it is a physical spell skill gem. And gem levels are one of the most powerful ways to scale Corrupting Fever. So this in combination with physical damage clusters, physical damage over time clusters, or any sort of stuff like that, will have you doing pretty good damage in almost no time. But how does Corrupting Fever work exactly? So far, I've mentioned Corrupting Fever and Corrupting Blood, and these aren't quite the same thing. When used, the Corrupting Fever skill costs life. You spend this life to put a buff on yourself. For the duration of the buff, something that is affected by skill effect duration for example, anytime you hit an enemy, you'll apply Corrupting Blood. The amount of damage that you deal with that hit does not matter. The Corrupting Blood is not scaled by the damage of a hit. It cannot critically strike. However, this means that if you're using an attack to apply Corrupting Fever, you'll need to be aware of accuracy rating. If you miss, you'll apply no Corrupting Blood. On the other hand, spells don't care about accuracy, so if you use a spell like Stormbrand, all you care about is how many hits per second you can get in. This is why, on the attack side, things like Kinetic Blast, Rain of Arrows, and Tornado Shot are often used, and on the spell side, Stormbrand or Ball Lightning are very popular, because things that tend to hit a lot are a lot more effective at applying Corrupting Blood. So that's the basics of how Corrupting Blood and Corrupting Fever work. I'm going to get into a few more advanced things, but before I do, a quick reminder that if you're finding this video useful, please do leave a like, as that really helps me out in the YouTube algorithm. If you want to see more about this build, I'm going to be doing a build showcase talking about my gear and my choices, so be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss that. And finally, there's a summary of this video available over on my Patreon at the $5 level. This is for people to be able to read through at their own pace, and it has a couple of handy pictures as references. But don't worry, it's all the same info that I've covered here, just in a slightly different form. And now, back to some of those more advanced things when talking about Corrupting Fever. The first of which is, because it's a duration buff on you, the map mod buffs expire on players 70% faster is extremely detrimental. On the other hand, if you're using an item like Solstice Vigil or you have Temporal Chains applied to yourself, buffs will expire slower on you, which means the buff will last for longer. Also, this skill innately costs life, and that cost scales with gem level. It can get quite expensive. For example, on my current character, it costs me around 5,000 life out of my 5,900 just to use the skill. There are a couple of ways around this, the first of which is to use an anomalous Corrupting Fever, which gains reduced life cost based on its quality. Another way to get around this is reduced cost of skills and reduced life cost of skills, which is available on the tree from certain nodes. But don't get too scared by this number, since you won't be constantly spamming it. It's not like you use Corrupting Fever, and then the buff falls off, and you have to use it again. Because as long as you're spending life frequently, such as with a life-tapped skill to apply Corrupting Fever, the buff will constantly refresh itself. For example, with my Corrupting Fever, I have to spend a total of 305 life within its 9-second duration to be able to refresh the buff. And something else that's really nice about Corrupting Fever is it does a surprising amount of damage. Now, if you just look at POB, the DPS won't look all that impressive. Very often, a well-geared Corrupting Fever character will only have 3 or 4 million DPS. However, Corrupting Blood damage is one of the closest things in Path of Exile to true damage. Most enemies and players' main defense against physical damage is armor, but physical damage over time completely negates that. And since there's no such thing as physical resistance, most bosses won't have any defenses against your Corrupting Fever. The exception being if they roll additional physical damage reduction, or certain rare monster mods that can be rather annoying on a metamorph. But if you're talking about something like Cirrus, it'll feel a lot more smooth than you're expecting, especially since the build will have naturally high DPS uptime, since you only have to hit something once or twice to fully reapply your Corrupting Fever. And don't worry, if you hit an enemy, it will refresh all of your current stacks. You don't really have to worry about them falling off. Now, Corrupting Fever is often paired with other skills. This is because it does have relatively low overall damage if you're not able to scale the gem levels very well, such as if you're under-geared. And in that case, some popular choices are things like Reap or Exsanguinate. They're both physical damage over time skills, and while they do scale off of spell damage, they also scale off of pretty much all the same things as Corrupting Fever. Alternatively, some people like to use Corrupting Fever as a supplementary damage addition on a bleed build. If you're using Crimson Dance, and you want to hit things a lot of times to inflict a bunch of bleeds anyway, this does make sense. It won't be scaled quite as well, since damage over time multiplier for bleeding, and bleeding damage don't scale Corrupting Fever or Corrupting Blood. Remember, Corrupting Blood is not bleed. But on the other hand, it still scales really well off of gem levels, and if you stick it in a 5-link pair of gloves, it'll often do about 1 mil extra damage, and you can kind of think of that as free extra damage on top of what you're already doing. Of course, the most popular ascendancies for this are Gladiator and Ascendant, due to the physical damage over time bonus. So overall, Corrupting Fever is a really interesting skill, and with the Arch Nemesis changes, I actually think it's pretty well positioned right now. It's very good at dealing with almost all content, since very few rare monsters, Empowered Elements being the only one that I can think of off the top of my head, are incredibly resistant to its damage. Because it's not bleeding, you don't have to worry about enemies having a chance to avoid bleeding, although also because it's not bleeding, that can be a problem for you if you're unaffected by bleeding, but still have to deal with corrupted blood. Do keep in mind that if you as a player are getting bleed immunity from flasks, the bleed immunity will always be paired with corrupted blood immunity, and luckily for us, the monsters don't get flasks, so they don't have that luxury. Even if the damage for your Corrupting Fever looks really low in Path of Building, and only ends up being 1 to 3 million, don't be too concerned. You'll find that the very high damage uptime and the fact that very few things have defenses against it make it feel a lot smoother than it otherwise would. And finally, remember that the buff has a duration, and so does the secondary Corrupting Blood debuff. So if you ever have less skill effect duration, such as from Swift Affliction, it will affect both parts of a skill, and that can be problematic in certain situations. Most of the time, it should be totally fine, but it is something to be aware of and keep in mind. So I'm curious, have you ever played a Corrupting Fever build before? And if not, do you plan to? Let me know your thoughts or experiences down in the comments below. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, be sure to put them down in the comments below, or join the Discord, where you can ask questions, get build help, and hang out with the community. A special thanks to my patrons and YouTube channel members. They're awesome, and they get to show it by having their name on screen in the credits of all my videos. So if you want to see your name here, be sure to check the link in the description. For more general gaming content, check out my second channel, 10 Gaming Thoughts, and if you want a water bottle or a cool shirt, I have a link to my official merch shop in the description. I hope you learned something today, and I hope to see you again sometime soon.